He thought he'd seen it all, until a 7-year-old girl stepped into his high-rise office during a snowstorm, clutching a faded bouquet and a handwritten note. "I sell flowers. I don't complain. I want to save my brother." Her name is Sophie. The man is David Lawson, a millionaire CEO known for boardroom power, not quiet tears. But Sophie's courage and desperation crack something inside him. She came through the storm, believing a stranger could save her brother from leukemia. What David doesn't expect is the scarf Sophie carries. Hand-knitted, with a familiar pattern tied to the mother he lost decades ago. Why does a stranger's scarf look like his mother's? What secrets bind them? Subscribe for the full story, because some miracles wear mittens. The snow fell in thick, uneven sheets that afternoon, coating the sidewalks of downtown Chicago in silence. Most people hurried indoors, heads ducked, shoulders tight. But Sophie, just 7 years old, walked steadily through it all, her tiny boots soaked, her gloved fingers wrapped tightly around a fading bouquet of paper flowers. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She simply kept walking, with purpose far beyond her years. Inside the mirrored tower of Lawson Enterprises, the receptionist barely looked up when the glass doors hissed open. "We're not hiring," she began, but Sophie, undeterred, stepped forward and handed her a piece of notebook paper. It was folded carefully in fourths. The handwriting was clumsy but determined. "I sell flowers. I know how to take care of gardens. I don't complain. I just want to save my brother. Please, help." The receptionist blinked, unsure what to say. Sophie didn't wait. "Please, give it to Mr. Lawson." 30 floors above, David Lawson, CEO, venture strategist, and the man Fortune magazine called Chicago's coldest climber, stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, sipping espresso and watching the storm roll in. At 46, David had everything that was supposed to matter: a net worth nearing $500 million, a luxury apartment overlooking the lake, and the kind of boardroom reputation that made even the most seasoned executives lower their voices in his presence. But success hadn't come without cost. His childhood was a long-forgotten attic of pain, sealed off by time and pride. His mother had vanished when he was just 10, an unexplainable absence that hardened every part of him. Love had never survived in the vacuum she left behind. So, when his assistant knocked gently and said, "There's a child downstairs asking to see you," David almost laughed. "I don't do interviews with children." She didn't ask for an interview, she asked for help. He turned, skeptical. "Help?" "She left this," the assistant said, holding out the note, "and she's still downstairs, in the snow." David read it once, then again. Something in the simplicity of the words tugged unexpectedly at him. He handed back his espresso and said, "Send her up." A few minutes later, the elevator dinged, and Sophie stepped onto the executive floor, snow melting in her hair. Her coat was too big, clearly second-hand, and her cheeks were red from the cold. But her chin lifted as she approached his desk, and in her small hand she held out the drooping bouquet. "For you," she said. "I made them myself." David took the flowers wordlessly. The stems were newspaper rolled tight, the petals soft tissue painted with watercolor. They were crude, fragile, beautiful. "What's your name?" "Sophie." He gestured toward a chair, but she shook her head. "I won't stay long. I came to ask if you have a job for me." David tilted his head. "You want a job? I can sweep floors, or water plants, or sell flowers in your lobby. I won't ask for much." "Why?" he asked, leaning forward. "Why do you need a job, Sophie?" Her voice didn't shake. "My brother Ben is sick. He has leukemia. Mommy says we don't have money for the next treatment. We sold the car, then the TV, then everything else. Now we live in a little trailer with no heat. I thought, maybe someone with a big building like this could help." David was silent. Something inside him tightened, an ache he couldn't name. "Why me?" Sophie pulled a wrinkled flyer from her coat pocket. It was one of his old company ads from a transit shelter. His name, bold across the top, underlined by the phrase, "We build hope." "I thought it meant you're someone who helps," she said. He looked at the ad, then back at the child before him. "Where's your brother now?" "St. Jude's Public Wing, room 204. It's cold there, sometimes the heater doesn't work, but I bring him my scarf." David stood slowly. "Take me to him." Sophie blinked. "You'll really come?" "I said I would, didn't I?" She nodded solemnly. "Okay, but we have to hurry. Visiting hours end soon." David didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, told his assistant to cancel his afternoon, and followed a little girl with snow in her hair and strength in her voice down 30 flights of marble and chrome. The city outside was still wrapped in white silence, but something had shifted. He didn't know it yet, but the next hour would break open a door in his past he thought was long buried. And in the quiet center of that door was something else entirely, a knitted scarf, and a mother's forgotten touch. The cab ride to St. Jude's Public Wing was silent at first. David sat across from Sophie, studying her as she stared out the frosted window. Her tiny hands were clasped in her lap, resting on the tattered hem of her coat. He had met heads of state, CEOs of global conglomerates, and elite venture capitalists, but none of them had unnerved him the way this small girl did. "How old is your brother?" he asked gently. 12, she replied without turning. "He used to be taller than me. Now he sleeps most of the time." David hesitated, watching her profile. "And your parents?" "My mom passed away 2 years ago. Pneumonia. We didn't have heat that winter either." Her voice remained steady, like she was reciting a story she'd practiced. "Ben took care of me. Then he got sick and I had to grow up." David swallowed hard. "And your father?" "He left before I was born. Just a name on my birth certificate. Ben never liked talking about him." The car pulled to a stop outside the hospital. Even from the curb, it looked grim. Gray stone, cracked windows, fluorescent lights buzzing behind fingerprint-streaked glass. David's chest tightened. The place looked nothing like the private hospitals he'd donated to over the years. This was where children like Sophie ended up, forgotten by everyone who made decisions in boardrooms like his. They entered through the main doors. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and something more subtle. Fear, maybe. A weary nurse behind the desk gave Sophie a small smile and nodded toward the elevator. "You know the way." David followed as Sophie led him down dim corridors lit by flickering bulbs. The floors creaked beneath his Italian leather shoes. The walls bore peeling posters with slogans like, "Hope heals and you are not alone." But the hollowness in the halls told another story. Finally, they reached room 204. Inside, a boy lay motionless in a narrow hospital bed. Tubes ran from his nose to a noisy oxygen unit in the corner. His skin was pale, his lips dry and cracked. His dark hair clung to his forehead with sweat. On the bedside table sat a single wilted paper flower in a chipped cup. "Ben," Sophie whispered, stepping forward. "This is Mr. David. He's the one I told you about." Ben didn't stir. David remained by the door for a long moment, unable to cross the invisible line between his world and theirs. Then he stepped forward, knelt beside the bed, and gently placed the bouquet of paper flowers on the tray table. "I'm here to help," he said softly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, pulling a small folded blanket from her backpack. She tucked it around Ben's legs, her hands careful, her touch practiced. "I bring this every day. It's his favorite. Mom made it before she got sick." David looked around the room. No monitors, no IV stand, just a plastic chart clipped to the wall and a few spare oxygen canisters. The heater wheezed from the corner, barely warming the space. "How long has he been like this?" "A week," Sophie said. They said his body's too tired now, but he still hears me. I know he does." David nodded solemnly, then reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. "I want him transferred." Sophie blinked. "What do you mean?" "To Mercy's Children's Center, today. I'll cover everything: transport, treatment, specialists. I want him in a place where he can fight." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Slowly, she stood. You really mean it?" "I do," David said, his voice unwavering. "No more snow on his windows. No more waiting for miracles. We'll bring them." Tears finally welled in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. "Thank you." He knelt again to meet her gaze. "But, Sophie, this will take time. He'll need more than just money. He'll need someone who believes. That's you. You keep talking to him. You keep believing." She nodded fiercely, the strength in her tiny face igniting something unfamiliar in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. As he stood to make the necessary calls, Sophie pulled something else from her backpack. A long, faded scarf, worn and carefully folded. "I brought this for Ben," she whispered, wrapping it around her brother's neck with delicate hands. "Mom made it before she got too tired. It keeps him warm." David froze. The pattern on the scarf, rows of small, staggered stars in alternating blue and green, was unmistakable. His mother had knitted that same design once. Only one person ever did it just like that. He stared at the stitching, his heartbeat unsteady. Where did she learn to make this? Sophie looked up. "I don't know. She said it was the only pattern she remembered from her childhood." A chill ran through him, sharper than the wind outside. David Lawson had come to save a boy, but he had just touched a thread leading straight to a past he thought was buried forever. David stood outside room 204 long after the medical transport team had wheeled Ben away. The hallway smelled of age and antiseptic, but he wasn't aware of either. His mind had latched onto something else, something buried deep in memory. The scarf. He could still see the stars his mother used to stitch in quiet moments on cold evenings, the exact pattern now wrapped around a fragile boy's neck. She'd only ever made one like it for David, saying it was a tradition from her childhood, passed down by someone she never named. The sight of it now, decades later, around a child with no father and a sister who barged into his office carrying the weight of the world, wasn't coincidence. It was a whisper, a ghost. His phone buzzed. "Mr. Lawson," said a calm voice. "Ben has arrived at Mercy's Children's. The team is prepping for a full workup now. We'll start treatment tonight." "Thank you," David said quietly. "Make sure his sister is comfortable. Give her anything she needs." "Yes, sir." He hung up slowly and turned down the corridor. As he exited the hospital into the harsh winter wind, Sophie caught up to him, clutching a worn messenger bag and her little boots scraping against the icy pavement. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Is Ben going to a better place now?" David bent down, cupping her shoulders with both hands. "He's going to the best hospital in the city," he said softly, "and he'll have doctors who won't stop fighting for him, just like you haven't." Sophie's eyes glistened, wide and trusting. "And you'll keep your promise?" "I already did," he replied, brushing a snowflake from her hair. "But we'll need to do more." She smiled, and it broke him a little. That smile wasn't carefree. It was earned. The kind of smile that survives storms, not sunshine. They got into his car. She hesitantly, still unsure of what was proper. David gave her space. On the drive to the hospital, Sophie watched the snow falling against the window with the kind of deep quiet that made her seem far older than 7. "I can't remember my mom's laugh," she said suddenly. "I try to, every night, but it's like it's locked behind something I don't have the key for." David's chest ached. "What do you remember about her?" "She used to hum when she cooked, and when she was sad, she'd go outside and water the plants, even when they were dead. She said things still need care, even when they look like they're gone. David nodded slowly, the ache settling deeper. She sounds wise. Sophie's voice lowered to a whisper. She told me. She had a brother once, a long time ago, but they got separated when they were really young. David turned sharply. She said that. She never said his name, just that she wished she could have said goodbye. Sophie looked down. Maybe that's why she sang sad songs. He felt the breath leave his body. That couldn't be. It was too much. Too precise. But the scarf, the pattern, the memory of a sister who vanished when they were kids and got lost in the foster care system. Do you remember your mom's full name? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. Her name was Margaret, Sophie said. Margaret Lawson, but everyone called her Maggie. David's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The world tilted again, twice in 1 week. Maggie, his sister, his Maggie, the sister he'd lost to the state after their parents' accident. The one he'd searched for as a teenager until life and success and ambition pulled him too far forward. She'd once been his world, his shadow, his partner in every childhood game. They'd been separated at 10 and 6. The system had failed them. He never found her again, until now. He stopped the car in front of the hospital and looked at Sophie, her cheeks red with cold and hope. I think your mother, he began, then stopped. Not yet. Not without certainty. He couldn't drop that truth into her lap like a stone, not while her brother was still fighting to survive. But he would find the truth. And if Sophie was his niece, if Maggie had died never knowing he'd spent years wondering where she was, then he would do whatever it took to rewrite that ending for her children. He walked Sophie to the hospital's family waiting area, now warm and bright with soft lights and a stocked kitchenette. She curled into a chair with a blanket as a nurse brought her cocoa. David sat beside her, studying her face. I'll come back tomorrow, he promised. Promise with a capital P? She asked with a smile. With a capital everything. She giggled, and in that sound, David heard an echo, a note of a laugh that once filled his childhood home. He closed his eyes and saw Maggie on the swing set, her scarf trailing behind her as she kicked at the wind. This wasn't charity anymore. This was home, calling him back. The next morning, David arrived at the hospital just after dawn, balancing 2 paper cups of cocoa and a bag of fresh bagels. He hadn't slept much. Instead, he'd spent the night combing through dusty family records, adoption papers, and a single surviving photo of a girl in braids named Maggie Lawson. He'd traced what little digital footprint there was. An old apartment lease, a short stint working at a florist. Then, nothing. Until Sophie. As he entered the pediatric floor, he saw her curled up in the corner of the waiting room, her cheek pressed to the back of her hand, a hospital blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Despite everything, her breathing was soft and steady. A nurse nearby whispered, "She stayed up late, wouldn't leave her brother's side." David nodded, setting the bag down gently. He turned toward Ben's room and paused at the threshold. Inside, doctors were reviewing charts. Machines beeped a quiet, solemn rhythm. Ben lay still, but his face looked calmer, his brow less furrowed, his chest rising more easily with each breath. Dr. Hammond approached him quietly. The treatment started. His vitals have stabilized, but it's too early to predict anything. What he needs now is rest and a reason to fight. David looked past the doctor at the boy, frail, pale, but still there, still holding on. He has both, David said softly. He has Sophie. Later that morning, Sophie woke to the smell of cinnamon. She blinked, confused, until she saw David sitting across from her, his tie slightly crooked, sleeves rolled. "You brought breakfast?" she asked groggily. He smiled gently. "You're helping save your brother. Seems like the least I can do." She sat up slowly. brushing her hair behind one ear. "I dreamed last night," she murmured, "that he was better. He was laughing and planting flowers again. He always said they bloomed better when someone believed in them." David handed her a bagel. "Then we'll make sure he keeps planting." Sophie smiled shyly, unwrapping her breakfast with care. After a few bites, she pulled her faded canvas bag onto her lap and began rummaging through it. "Do you want to see something?" she asked. "Of course." She pulled out a crumpled folder and opened it, revealing several pressed paper flowers, each one delicately folded and painted with watercolors. "My brother made these with me," she said. "Every time he got too tired to go outside, we'd make flowers for people who didn't have any." David picked one up gently. The petals were careful, deliberate. There was talent in the brushstrokes, tiny veins painted in soft purples and blues. "Do you still make them?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "I made one for you." She handed him a flower she'd kept in the corner of the folder. This one was different. Its petals were red and gold, and in the center she had painted a tiny star. "It means you're a wish come true," she said solemnly, "even if you didn't know it yet." David's throat tightened. He ran a thumb over the paper edges, unsure whether to speak or let the silence hold the moment. "You're very brave, Sophie." She looked down. "Not really. I just don't want to be alone again." He looked at her then, not as a CEO or a benefactor, but as a man who had known the same ache of silence, of losing family and not being able to fix it. "You're not alone," he said gently. "Not anymore." That afternoon, David met with the hospital administrator to confirm the full transfer of Ben's medical care. He insisted on funding a year's worth of support for the pediatric oncology ward. Quietly, anonymously. Back upstairs, he found Sophie drawing in the corner with markers the nurses had provided. She was sketching a garden, one with wild sunflowers and roses growing alongside bright paper blooms. "Do you like plants?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I love them," she replied. "They don't care if you're small or quiet. If you give them light and water, they still grow." David smiled. "Would you want to see a real garden sometime? One with vines climbing the walls and the lavender that hums when the bees come?" She beamed. "I'd love that." "Good," he said. "I think I know a place." That night, as the sky turned a dusky blue and snow blanketed the city in soft silence, David sat in his study, holding the paper flower Sophie had made for him. Next to it sat a small photo. Maggie, at age 6, grinning with a missing front tooth, clutching a scarf around her neck. He opened a box that had remained untouched for nearly 20 years. Inside were 3 letters Maggie had written before the system moved her to a new foster home. One line stood out from the page. "If you find me again someday, bring flowers. I'll know it's you." David closed his eyes, pressing the flower to his chest. He hadn't found Maggie in time. But he'd found her children, and he would not fail them. It was just past noon when David parked his car in front of the weathered brick building Sophie had pointed out. The hospital may have offered warmth and light, but her family's reality lived here, in a sagging complex on the edge of town where the windows were lined with frost and the sidewalks hadn't been shoveled in days. Sophie held his hand tighter than usual. Her small boots crunched the ice, her other hand carefully clutching a folded scarf. "He'll want to say thank you," she said softly, "even if he can't speak much today." David nodded, placing a comforting hand over hers. "We'll sit with him quietly. Just be there." They climbed the narrow stairwell to the 3rd floor, where peeling numbers marked apartment 3B. Sophie knocked twice, then opened the door with a key hidden in her mitten. The space was dim, quiet, and achingly cold. A single electric heater buzzed near the wall, doing its best to cut through the winter chill. Inside, Ben lay on a thin mattress beside a lamp that flickered with each heartbeat of the grid. A woman sat nearby, mid-30s, pale from fatigue but sharp-eyed and protective. She stood as soon as David entered. Sophie spoke up before introductions. "Miss Clara, this is the man I told you about. He helped Ben. He's our friend." Clara nodded slowly. Her gaze landed on David's tailored coat, his watch, the quiet confidence in his posture. She crossed her arms, unsure. "You one of those churchmen? Here to save souls with pamphlets?" David offered a kind smile. "No, I just came because Sophie asked me to." Clara's brow softened slightly. She motioned toward the corner chair. "Don't mind the mess. I do what I can. But after Ben got sick, it got harder." David took a seat and glanced around. There were coloring pages taped to the fridge. A cracked vase on the windowsill held a single plastic tulip, and beneath the coffee table a stack of school books. This wasn't a place that had given up, just one that hadn't been given much. Ben stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, slow and heavy. Sophie sprang to his side. "Benny," she whispered, tucking the scarf under his head. "I brought the man from the building, the one I told you about." Ben turned his head slightly, his lips parting in a weak attempt at a smile. David leaned in, lowering his voice to a gentle hum. "It's an honor to meet you, Ben. Your sister's told me everything. You're the reason she's so brave." Ben blinked, once, long, deliberate. Sophie reached for her brother's hand, curling her fingers through his. "He brought us here. He promised you'd get better, and I think he's going to stay." David swallowed hard, then turned to Clara. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to move both of them somewhere safe, somewhere warm. Ben needs full-time care. Sophie needs school and sleep. You've done everything. Let me help with the rest." Clara's mouth tightened. "You don't know us. Why would you do that?" David hesitated. Then he said quietly, "Because once, someone like Ben and Sophie was taken from me, and I didn't get a second chance. I won't waste this one." For a long moment, Clara studied him. Then she nodded, slowly. "If you're serious, we pack tonight." They left the apartment an hour later. Sophie bounced slightly with each step despite the cold, her mittened hands swinging beside her. She turned to David suddenly, mid-walk. "Do you have kids?" David hesitated. "No. Did you ever want some?" A beat passed. "Yes," he said softly. "I did. More than anything." Sophie nodded like she understood more than her age should have allowed. "Maybe we can be practice." David chuckled gently. "I'd like that." That evening, he arranged everything: an emergency transfer to a top pediatric care unit, a suite for Sophie and Clara near the hospital, a trust fund with both children's names. He instructed his assistant to set up appointments for therapy, tutoring, and legal advice for guardianship inquiries. And then, quietly, he walked back into his penthouse, past the sleek marble counters and the echoing silence. He sat at the piano he hadn't touched in 15 years and rested Sophie's flower on the music stand. He pressed a key, then another. It was clumsy at first, rusted. But after a while, the music found him again, just as Sophie had. The morning after the move, David stood by the hospital room window, watching snow drift gently over the city skyline. Behind him, the pediatric unit buzzed softly with nurses, beeping monitors, and the quiet resilience of children too brave for their age. Ben lay in a clean hospital bed now, warmed by sunlight and a state-of-the-art climate control system, not a cheap space heater in a frigid apartment. His cheeks held a little more color, his breath steadier under the oxygen line. Sophie sat beside him on a small cushioned bench, swinging her legs, humming a lullaby so old it didn't have words anymore, just melody and memory. David entered slowly, holding a cup of hot cocoa he'd asked the kitchen to prepare especially for her. "No marshmallows," he said gently, "but they said it's got just the right swirl of chocolate." Sophie beamed as she accepted it with two hands. "You remembered." "I try," David said with a soft smile. He turned to Ben, whose eyes fluttered open with effort. "You're back," the boy rasped. "I said I would be," David replied, pulling the chair closer. "You just focus on getting better." Ben looked at his sister, then at the room, the machines, the monitors, the window with its view of the park. "This is too much," he murmured. "We can't pay for any of this." David shook his head slowly. "You don't have to. I've already taken care of it. Your job is to rest." Ben blinked at him, confused, grateful, overwhelmed. And then Sophie did something that made the room go still. She reached into her small backpack, pulled out a folded knit scarf, faded gray with a red chevron pattern, and draped it carefully over Ben's shoulders. Then she turned to David and said, "Our mom made this before she left. I didn't know what to do with it, but now I think maybe it belongs to all three of us." David stepped back, the breath knocked out of him. He knew that pattern. It wasn't just familiar. It was the same as the scarf his own mother had knitted during her final winter, the one she wore the night she disappeared without explanation. She used to hum that same tune Sophie sang. He hadn't heard it in decades. "Where did your mother get this scarf?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Sophie glanced at Ben, then back at David. "We don't know. It was just always there. Mom said it was from someone she used to love a long time ago. She never talked about it." David slowly reached for the edge of the scarf, fingers trembling. There, stitched faintly into the corner, were initials, M.L. His mother's, Margaret Lawson. He staggered back slightly and sat down. The hospital room was quiet except for the rhythmic beep of Ben's heart monitor and Sophie's soft sip of cocoa. "Are you okay?" she asked, climbing onto the chair beside him. David nodded, but his thoughts raced. His mother had vanished after a bitter fight when he was still in his 20s. All she'd left behind was an empty house and a letter that said, "You've forgotten what matters, David. I hope you remember one day." He never did find her, until now. "Can I tell you a secret?" David said, eyes still on the scarf. "When I was your age, someone made me cocoa just like this, and when I got sick, really sick, it was my mom who stayed with me every night. She had a scarf just like that one." Sophie looked up at him, tilting her head slightly. "Do you think maybe she knew our mom?" "Maybe," David whispered. "Maybe she was your mom's friend. Or maybe something more." A nurse entered, smiling warmly. "Mr. Lawson, Dr. Patel asked if you'd like to join the evening check-in. It's part of the Guardian program for special pediatric cases." David looked at her, startled by the word. Guardian. He wasn't ready to claim anything, not yet, but the weight of that scarf, those initials, the warmth in Sophie's eyes as she leaned her head against his shoulder, it all pointed to something larger than chance. "Yes," he said, clearing his throat. "I'd like that." As the nurse left, Ben stirred again. "Why are you helping us?" he asked weakly. David knelt by his side. "Because once, someone gave up everything for me, and I didn't understand what that meant until you and your sister walked into my life." Ben tried to nod, but couldn't. His eyes closed slowly, peacefully. That night, David returned to his penthouse, removed the scarf he'd worn every winter out of habit, and replaced it with the one Sophie had given. He stood in front of the mirror, saw himself as someone softer, someone reshaped by the smallest outstretched hand. Not just a man with money, but a man rediscovering purpose. The kind of man, he hoped, his mother had believed he could become. 2 days after Ben's transfer, the pediatric oncology ward at St. Jude's was quieter than usual. Snow continued to fall outside, frosting the windows in delicate patterns that looked almost like lace. Sophie pressed her palm against the glass, watching the flurries dance under the city lights as dusk began to settle in. David sat nearby. legs crossed, reading aloud from a weathered storybook he'd found in the hospital's community shelf. A tale about a gardener who brings color back to a gray town. His voice was softer now, more patient, carrying a warmth that only Sophie and Ben had managed to unlock. Ben stirred under his quilt, and Sophie rushed to his side, hopeful. His eyes blinked open, dry, red-rimmed, but aware. "Hey," she whispered, brushing a loose curl from his forehead. "You're awake." Ben's gaze drifted slowly to David. "You came back," he murmured hoarsely. "I promised, didn't I?" David said, standing and walking over. "How do you feel?" Ben gave a weak shrug. "Tired. Like I ran up 100 stairs." "You'll get stronger," Sophie said confidently, her little hand wrapped around his. "Mr. David fixed everything." David chuckled quietly, kneeling beside the bed. "Not everything," he admitted, "but we're working on it." Ben looked at his sister, then back at David. "You're not like people we've met before. Most people leave." The words cut deeper than David expected. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded drawing Sophie had left in the waiting room, a sketch of a sunflower blooming through snow. "Sophie drew this," he said gently. "She told me you once said that hope is like a flower that doesn't wait for spring." Ben's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Yeah, I told her that. I didn't think she remembered." "She remembered everything," David said, placing the drawing at Ben's bedside. "And I will, too." Just then, the door creaked open and a nurse stepped in. "Sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Patel wants to speak with you, Mr. Lawson. She's in the family lounge." David nodded and glanced at Sophie. "You'll stay with your brother?" "Always," she said with quiet conviction. The hallway was warm, the overhead lights humming. Dr. Patel stood near the coffee machine, clipboard in hand, her face composed but serious. "Ben's condition is stabilizing," she began. "But there are still some uncertainties. His immune system is fragile, and recovery will take time. Months, possibly longer. I'll support whatever it takes," David replied immediately. "Private care, housing, therapy. Just tell me what's needed." Dr. Patel hesitated, then asked, "And what about guardianship?" David's mouth opened slightly, uncertain. "They don't have anyone?" "Not anyone suitable. Social services is looking into distant relatives, but Sophie and Ben clearly trust you. And frankly, you've already been acting as their guardian." David exhaled slowly, the word again. He'd built companies, signed billion-dollar deals, spoken at world summits. But this felt different, bigger, more terrifying, and more sacred. "I want to be what they need," he said finally. "Not just for today, but long-term. How do we start?" Dr. Patel smiled warmly. "We'll walk you through it." Later that night, David returned to the room with 2 cups of hot tea. Sophie had fallen asleep beside Ben's bed, her head resting gently near his elbow, her arm protectively across his chest. Ben, still drowsy but conscious, was humming a lullaby, barely audible, but the same melody Sophie had hummed days earlier. David lowered himself into the armchair and simply listened. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to check his phone. He didn't think about contracts or flights or press releases. He just sat in the glow of something profoundly human, completely unscripted. After a moment, Ben whispered, "Mr. David, will you still be here tomorrow?" David didn't answer right away. He stood, took the scarf Sophie had draped over the back of a chair, and gently tucked it around Ben's shoulders once more. Then he leaned down, looked Ben in the eyes, and said softly, "I'll be here every tomorrow you need." Outside, the snow slowed, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Snow was still falling when David returned the next morning, arms full of breakfast and books. The hospital room smelled faintly of cinnamon from the warm muffins he'd picked up at a nearby cafe. It was a small gesture, but something about it felt intimate, as though he were bringing breakfast not to two children he'd only just met, but to family. Sophie looked up from her drawing with a sleepy smile. "You came back." David smiled warmly, setting the tray down. "I told you I would." Ben, propped up slightly now with more color in his cheeks, chuckled weakly. "She made me guess what kind of muffin you'd bring. I said blueberry. She said apple." "Cinnamon apple," David said proudly, revealing the warm, sweet pastries. "Guess Sophie wins." "I always win," she said cheerfully, and David couldn't help but laugh. It was startling how quickly they were becoming the brightest part of his day. Sophie reached into her tattered backpack, pulling out a folded piece of old cloth. She held it up reverently and walked over to Ben, who reached out instinctively. Gently, she draped it around his shoulders. A hand-knitted scarf, worn but beautifully patterned in deep navy and forest green. "I promised Mom I'd save it for when he got better," she said solemnly. "She made it before she left." David froze. The pattern on the scarf, it was identical to the one his mother used to knit for him each winter. The same unique weave, a style she said was only for family. A memory flared. Sitting by the fireplace decades ago, his mother's gentle hands working the yarn, her voice low and soothing. "This one's for you, David, so you never forget who you belong to." He hadn't seen that pattern in over 30 years. Where did you get that scarf?" he asked carefully, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie turned, cradling the frayed edge like a treasure. "It was in the old box from Mom. She said it was from someone who once loved her very much. She said it's what kept her warm when things got really cold." David sank into the chair, his breath caught in his chest. "Do you know your mother's name?" he asked, heart pounding. Sophie nodded slowly. "Her name was Grace. Grace Lynn. Before she died, she told us to always keep the scarf close, and that one day we'd meet someone who'd recognize it." A silence fell over the room. David felt the room tilt slightly, reality blurring with memory. Grace Lynn, his mother's best friend, his first love, the woman he lost touch with after he took over his father's business and buried everything that didn't fit the empire he was building. He had never known she'd had children. Ben was watching him now, his pale blue eyes searching. "You okay, Mr. David?" David stood slowly, walked over, and knelt beside the hospital bed. "I knew your mom," he said gently. "A long time ago. She was kind, brave, always had paint on her fingers and poetry in her voice." Sophie blinked, stunned. "You knew her?" "She meant a lot to me, but we lost contact. I didn't know she was gone." Sophie's voice was suddenly fragile. "She got sick last winter. We tried everything, but by the time we found help, it was too late." David closed his eyes, grief settling in like a familiar ache. He had failed Grace once by letting her drift from his life. He would not fail her children now. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. Ben reached for Sophie's hand. She always said someone would come, someone who'd remember. David looked between them, his voice trembling. "I remember, and I'm not going anywhere." Later that afternoon, after the children had drifted into a much-needed nap, David found himself in the hospital chapel, staring at the stained glass window depicting a sunrise. The light poured in, fragmented and warm. He pulled out his phone and called Linda, his longtime attorney. "I need you to help me petition for temporary guardianship," he said firmly, "of 2 children, Sophie and Ben. And I want you to start the process for permanent custody." Linda was quiet. "Are you sure, David?" "Yes. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As he hung up, he placed his palm on the glass, watching the golden light fall across the floor like a silent vow. He didn't know what the future held. There would be legal hurdles, medical decisions, maybe even resistance. But something inside him had shifted completely. The scarf had told him what words never could. Family wasn't always built by blood. Sometimes it was stitched together, softly, slowly, by love that refused to be lost. The smell of antiseptic lingered faintly in the air, but for the first time since Ben had been admitted, the hospital room felt less like a place of survival and more like a sanctuary. It was warm, lived in, full of hope. David sat on the edge of the cot near Sophie, helping her arrange a row of small succulents in plastic pots he'd picked up that morning. "Plants don't mind if you talk too much," Sophie had said when he first brought them. "That's why they're better than people." He'd chuckled at the time, but now, hearing her hum as she gently patted soil, he realized it wasn't a joke. It was armor. Across the room, Ben stirred, his fingers twitching slightly as the afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds. Sophie dropped her tiny spade. "Ben!" David rose slowly. The nurse, who had just walked in with an IV adjustment, leaned in. "He's waking up." The heart monitor ticked a little faster. Then a raspy whisper, "Sophie." Sophie ran to the bed, nearly tripping over her own boots. "I'm here! I'm right here, Ben!" Ben's eyes fluttered open, pale blue and glassy but focused. "You didn't leave." "Never," she said, clutching his hand tightly. "You promised me we'd get through this, and guess what? We did. He's here now, Mr. David, the one from the sign. He helped." David stepped forward slowly, unsure if it was his place yet, unsure what this boy would think of the stranger suddenly tangled in his fate. Ben blinked, taking him in. His voice was faint, but certain. "You brought the soup?" David smiled, relief and emotion washing through him. "I did. I'll even bring cookies next time. Deal?" Ben gave the tiniest nod. "Only if they're chocolate chip. Only the best," David promised, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. The nurse adjusted Ben's oxygen line and gave them a discreet nod before slipping out, leaving them in the soft hum of monitors and new beginnings. Later that evening, David stood at the hospital window, watching snow drift gently outside. Sophie had fallen asleep, curled beside Ben's bed, one hand still wrapped around his. The scarf lay across both of them like a silent blessing. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The following day, the hospital social worker, a woman named Clarissa with kind eyes and a skeptical edge, invited David to her office. "I understand you're petitioning for guardianship," she said, tapping a file with Ben and Sophie's names on it. "I am," David replied firmly. She studied him for a long moment. "Forgive my directness, Mr. Lawson, but why? Most people in your position wouldn't get involved. You're not related by blood. You're a businessman." "I was," he interrupted gently, "but I missed too many things chasing. Boardroom victories. I don't want to miss this." Clarissa tapped her pen. "The children have had multiple disruptions. I need to be sure you're committed, not just emotionally, but practically." David leaned forward. "I'm ready to prove it, however long it takes, however many forms I have to sign. I'm not doing this out of pity or impulse. I knew their mother. I failed her once. I won't fail them." Something softened in Clarissa's expression. She reached for a form and slid it across the desk. "Then we begin with this. Temporary guardianship. If approved, you'll be responsible for their housing, medical care, education, and emotional well-being." "I'm already responsible," he said softly, picking up the pen. Back at the hospital, David found Sophie sitting cross-legged in a chair, sketching something in a notebook. She closed it quickly when she saw him. "Secret art?" he teased. Sophie bit her lip. "It's a surprise." He smiled and ruffled her hair. "I can wait." That night, Ben sat up for the first time, his voice clearer, his appetite returning. They played chess together, David's favorite game from childhood, and Ben beat him in 5 moves. Sophie cackled. "Told you not to underestimate him." "I've been hustled," David groaned, laughing despite himself. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't an empire. But in that little room, under flickering fluorescent lights, David Lawson felt more at home than he ever had in any corner office or penthouse suite. He didn't notice the nurse lingering by the doorway until she cleared her throat. "Mr. Lawson?" He turned. "Yes?" She smiled. "There's someone here asking for you, says she's a relative. A woman named Helen?" David's blood ran cold. He stood slowly, heart pounding. "Send her in." Sophie looked up. "Who's Helen?" David forced a smile. "Someone from before. Someone I thought I lost too." And as Helen stepped into the doorway, snow melting from her coat, her eyes locking with David's, he realized life had more surprises stitched into it than he'd ever dreamed. David stared at her in stunned silence. Helen stood in the doorway, her eyes wet, the scarf around her neck soaked with melted snow. Her presence was unreal, like a shadow walking out of memory. "Sophie," David whispered, his voice shaking. "This is Helen. My sister." Sophie blinked. "The one who made the scarf?" Helen stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "You remembered?" David nodded slowly. "I never forgot." Sophie looked between them, confusion knitting her brow. "So, you're my grandma?" Helen's breath caught. She looked at David in disbelief, then at Sophie. I didn't know. Are they—" "They're not mine by blood," David replied gently, "but they are now." Helen's gaze drifted to the hospital bed where Ben was sleeping soundly. She walked over, reverently, like approaching something sacred. Her trembling hand brushed his hair. "His mother, was she?" she began. David nodded. "Her name was Grace. She showed up one winter, years after you disappeared. We were never sure where she came from, just that she had your eyes and your quiet strength. When she passed, I didn't know what I was losing." Helen's shoulders quaked. "I was in a shelter in Duluth for years after the accident. No ID, no memory of who I was. Only in the last 6 months did it start coming back. I found the scarf in my old trunk, the one I made for you the Christmas before Mom died. It led me to search your name. I found you through the foundation." Sophie clutched David's hand. "So, this means we're a family?" He looked down at her, those bright, brave eyes, and nodded slowly. "Yes, it means just that." They spent hours that night at the hospital talking in low voices as snow fell gently beyond the windows. Helen told them stories from childhood, about the night their father brought home a stray cat, the first time David painted something good enough to hang in the hallway, the time she ran away from home and David walked 5 miles to find her before Mom could call the police. By the time the nurse dimmed the lights, Sophie had crawled into Helen's lap, fast asleep. Ben stirred briefly, murmuring something about soup, and David chuckled softly. "I've missed this," Helen whispered. "Not just you, this warmth." "I built so many walls," David admitted quietly. "Business, ambition, status, all of it to keep from feeling what I lost when you vanished. Grace, she broke through some of it. Sophie and Ben broke through the rest." Helen nodded. "And now?" He exhaled. "Now, I just want to build something that lasts." The next morning, David filed the final papers for legal guardianship. The court date was set, and though no one expected objections, it was still a process. When Sophie heard, she squeezed his arm tightly. "Does that mean you'll come to school events and sign my permission slips and make me eat vegetables?" David grinned. "All of the above." Ben added from his hospital bed, "He already makes us eat vegetables." Sophie groaned dramatically. "I knew it." Laughter warmed the room, like sunlight through storm clouds. Later that week, as Ben's condition stabilized and he began regaining his strength, David took them home, his home. But he no longer saw it as a monument to solitude. Now it pulsed with new life. He'd transformed one of the guest bedrooms into Sophie's art studio, complete with a real easel and a window that looked out over the garden. Ben's room had shelves for science kits, comic books, and the board games they now played almost every evening. One night, after tucking them in, David found Helen in the kitchen, carefully folding laundry that wasn't hers. She looked up, smiling. "Old habits," she said sheepishly. "It helps me feel useful." "You're not just useful," David said quietly. "You're needed." Helen blinked back tears. "It took me a long time to remember who I was, but being here, with them, with you, it feels like coming home." David poured them both tea and sat across from her. "I've been thinking about what's next." "Next?" Helen tilted her head. "I want to start something," he said. "A community center for families like Sophie and Ben. A place where no child has to sell flowers in a snowstorm just to be seen. We'll call it Grace House." Helen put a hand over her heart. "For her? For all of them." They sat there in silence, sipping tea, the hum of a new chapter echoing softly between them. Just then, Sophie shuffled in sleepily, dragging her blanket behind her like a tiny ghost. "Can't sleep," she murmured. David scooped her up effortlessly. "Come on, then. One more story." As he carried her back to bed, Sophie whispered drowsily, "You're the best thing that's ever happened to us." And David, heart aching with a quiet kind of joy, whispered back, "No, sweetheart, you are." The sound of laughter echoed through the halls of David's once silent home. It had only been a few weeks since Sophie and Ben moved in, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Morning light seemed brighter. Rooms felt fuller, and every hallway now held the faint scent of hope and something sweeter. Maybe it was cinnamon, or maybe it was just belonging. David stood at the edge of the garden, watching Helen teach Sophie how to plant tulip bulbs beneath the frost-hardened soil. Sophie wore a knitted beanie pulled over her ears, one of Helen's recent creations, and her cheeks glowed pink from the chill. "She's a quick learner," Helen called, glancing back with a proud smile. "She takes after you," David replied warmly. Ben sat on the porch wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping hot cocoa, a journal balanced on his knees. His hands still trembled slightly, but his strength was returning. The doctors were hopeful, and so was he. David walked over and sat beside him. "Writing again?" Ben nodded. "A story. About a boy who gets sick but finds a secret garden where everything grows back stronger." David's throat tightened. "That sounds like a story the world needs." Ben looked up, eyes shining. "It's kind of about me. And Sophie. And you." David reached over and squeezed his shoulder gently. "Thank you." Ben leaned into the quiet moment. "Is it okay if I call you Uncle David?" David looked at him, this brave boy who had weathered more storms than most grown men, and replied earnestly, "It would be an honor." That night they shared dinner around the kitchen table like they'd done it forever. Spaghetti with garlic bread, Helen's homemade apple pie, and laughter in between bites. Sophie retold a joke she'd heard on a cartoon, something silly involving a banana and a duck, and David laughed harder than he had in years. As the meal ended, Sophie tugged at his sleeve. "Are we official now?" David tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "Like, do we get to stay? For real?" she asked softly, afraid of the answer. He crouched beside her, brushing a curl away from her forehead. "Sweetheart, you've been part of my heart since the moment you walked into my office with that wrinkled note. You're not going anywhere." Her eyes shimmered, and she threw her arms around his neck. "Good, because this is the first place that feels like home." The next morning, they all stood before a family court judge. Papers had been filed, background checks cleared, and emotional statements written with care. David's lawyer spoke confidently about his intentions, his commitment, and the children's well-being. But it was Sophie who stole the room. When the judge asked if she wanted to live with Mr. Lawson, she stepped forward nervously and said, "He takes care of us. He listens when I talk, and he knows how to make broccoli almost taste good. I think he loves us already, and we love him too. So, yeah, I want to stay." Ben, quieter but no less sincere, simply added, "He didn't run when it got hard. That's family." Helen wept silently in the back row. The judge smiled, signed the order, and declared what they all already knew in their hearts. They were a family now. In the weeks that followed, Grace House opened its doors. What had once been a neglected brick building on the east side of town was now a vibrant sanctuary, a community center with tutoring programs, a greenhouse where kids could learn to grow things, an art room, and a quiet reading nook with donated books and second-hand beanbags. Sophie's flower stand, once battered by snow, now sat under a cheerful awning at the entrance, decorated with her own painted sign that read, "Hope grows here." David stood at the grand opening, flanked by Sophie and Ben, his arm around Helen's shoulder. A reporter from the local news asked, "What inspired this?" He looked down at the children beside him and replied gently, "They did. They reminded me that the most valuable thing I could ever build was trust." That night, back at home, David tucked Sophie into bed. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "Anything." She sat up slightly. "What if I hadn't walked into your office that day?" David smiled. "Then the snow would have brought you in another way. You were always meant to find me." "And the scarf?" she asked. "Was it really your mom's?" He nodded. "She used to say that love, when it's real, never unravels. Even when you think it's gone, it's still holding you warm." Sophie nestled under the covers, hugging a stuffed bunny they'd picked out together at the hospital gift shop. "I'm glad love found us again," she murmured. David leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." And, as he stepped into the hallway, he paused, just for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house, now alive with belonging. He didn't need riches to feel wealthy. He had them. The air was crisp with early spring, soft rays of sun filtering through the window panes of the kitchen as the smell of waffles and vanilla filled the house. David flipped the last golden piece onto the plate and smiled when he heard laughter drifting from the living room. Ben and Sophie were attempting a clumsy waltz across the hardwood floor, guided by a tutorial video on Helen's old tablet. They were growing fast. Sophie had taken to gardening like she'd been born with a green thumb, and Ben now kept a whiteboard in his room full of ideas for his next stories, inventions, and community projects. David watched them with a quiet pride only the truly humbled ever know. Helen entered with a gentle knock on the doorframe, carrying a stack of photo albums. "I found some old ones," she said softly, placing them on the table. "You might want to show them. Help the kids understand more of who they are." David nodded, his chest tightening with gratitude. "Thank you." Later that afternoon, they sat around the dining table flipping through the faded pages. Photos of David as a boy, his parents, the small garden where his mother used to grow snapdragons, and even one of his mother knitting on a porch swing. "That's the same pattern," Sophie gasped, pointing at the scarf in the photo. "The one she made that ended up with Ben." David nodded solemnly. "Your grandmother. She disappeared during a tough time in my life. I searched but never found her. I thought the scarf was lost forever, and then it found its way to you." Sophie looked down at the scarf in her lap, running her fingers gently over the woven threads. "Do you think she meant for us to find each other?" David's voice was thick with emotion. "I don't think she ever stopped loving me, and maybe love has a way of finishing what time couldn't." That evening, as the stars blinked over Denver's quiet skyline, David stood at the back porch watching the lights twinkle over the garden. A small easel stood under the oak tree. Sophie's newest creation sat on it. a crayon drawing of 4 people holding hands: Ben, Sophie, David, and Helen, under a banner that read, "Our Forever Family." He didn't hear her footsteps until Sophie came beside him, slipping her small hand into his. "Tomorrow's the first day of school," she said anxiously. "What if I get scared?" David knelt beside her. "Then I'll be there. I'll be waiting when the bell rings. I'll be cheering at your recitals. I'll be clapping when you win science fair ribbons, and I'll be hugging you tight when you're tired. I'm not just here for the good days, Sophie. I'm here for all of them." Her lips trembled into a smile. "You mean always?" He hugged her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Always. Months passed. Grace House became a beacon in the community. Families struggling with illness, homelessness, or hardship found not just food or shelter, but dignity, empathy, and a path forward. The garden flourished, and Ben's story, "The Boy and the Broken Garden," won first prize in a state writing contest. He was invited to read it aloud at a local library. The room was packed. David, dressed in a soft gray sweater instead of a tailored suit, sat in the front row beside Sophie and Helen, beaming with pride. Ben's voice was shaky at first, but steadied as he reached the end. "Sometimes the garden doesn't bloom right away, but if someone believes in it, if they water it, protect it, and wait for the sun, the most amazing things can grow." The audience erupted into applause. Ben looked up, tears shimmering in his eyes, and found David's gaze. They shared a nod that meant everything. On a warm Sunday morning, Sophie stood by the front gate, waiting. Her hair was tied back in a bright ribbon, and she wore a dress Helen had sewn for her. Sunflowers dotted the hem. A small car pulled up. The woman who stepped out had gray-streaked hair and kind eyes that instantly brimmed with tears. Sophie's breath caught. David walked out, holding her hand gently. "Sophie," he said softly, "this is my mother, your great-grandmother," and the older woman knelt down with trembling knees. "Oh, my girl, I thought I'd never get to see you, but love never gives up." Sophie stepped forward and hugged her tightly, burying her face into the warmth of a long-lost family embrace. And for the first time in decades, 3 generations stood together in the yard of a home no longer empty. That night, as fireflies danced in the garden, David sat on the porch swing with Helen beside him and the children asleep upstairs. "You gave them a future," she whispered. David looked toward the stars, then toward the closed door behind which Sophie and Ben now dreamed safely. "No," he murmured. "They gave me one.